Some people are shocked or even offended when they discover that the Bible is very interested in what happens in their bedroom and even in what doesn't go on. It's a hallmark, in fact, of the 66 books of the Bible that they're not just about what to believe about God, what you must believe about God, but also about what you must do because of what you believe about Him. The Bible is like a window where you can see God, but when you see the God in the window, you see He's looking back. Some religious people, in fact, over the centuries, been many people that have had the idea that things like sex and marriage are beneath God, that He's like way too high, way too holy to be thinking about sex. Of course, He would be thrilled to have you exulting in songs of praise, attends to every note and syllable that comes from your heart. But to think that He might be just as intensely interested in people's sex lives is, in fact, watching. Almost sounds a little creepy, although it's not. But God gave you a body, as we learned last week, to be a sacred space, a temple for Him. And everything that happens in His temple is intensely interesting to Him and important to Him. After all, it is His home. Well, today's passage is apostolic truth that makes it obvious that God is intimately involved in intimacy between the people He loves. When they experience sexual damage and disappointment, there's no one that hurts more than He does. And when they experience marital harmony, no one could be happier. As we turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we begin the second major part of Paul's letter. Up till now, he's been correcting problems that he's heard by the grapevine, disunity, impurity, lawsuits. And now he's going to address questions that the church or its leaders have formally raised in a recent letter. Paul has been out of town for a good 3 years, so they write to their founding missionary. He's in Ephesus, about, well, I looked it up, 242 miles away as the crow flies, or the ship sails. They want answer to quite a list of questions that we'll be studying during the next months. And the first issue that they bring up, or at least the first one that Paul zeroes in on, has to do with sex and marriage. It's a fitting continuation of the teaching in chapters 5 and 6 about immorality in the church and in the world. Paul ended chapter 6, in fact, with a very weighty conclusion, a command. So, if God bought and emancipated your body at the cost of Christ's death and turned it into His temple, then glorify God in your body, or glorify with your body God, because it is now His body. Now, you could say that all of chapter 7 is the application of that command. This would be like a masthead over the whole chapter. Every bit of it then is the outcome of the cross. And so if my body is God's, who bought it by paying a horrendous price called crucifixion, and if my body is therefore the instrument of glorification, not glorification of me, but of God, how do I use it for that? How do I take this old body such as it is, and use it to promote a high opinion of the God who bought it? Now, if you're like me, it takes a minute or two to come up with some possible physical acts where you could actually promote God's glory. First one, I thought it was martyrdom. That's a morbid place to start, but, and pretty much a one-time deal. But anyway, but then I thought of singing, which, it's a much less painful, or playing an instrument, maybe a tuba, or an amazing dance move, the perfect pirouette. Or an athletic feat like, Eric Little running, maybe climbing an unclimbable cliff in honor of the God who made it, or maybe building something useful or beautiful with your hands, or handling a child with loving care, maybe. But I think I know you well enough, and people in general, to realize that when you're asked to wonder how to glorify God with your body, you would eventually wonder about sex. How do you do that? How do you do sex in a way that glorifies God? And when you think about it, it's possible that your mind might go in the wrong direction. And probably not. In our time, asceticism, which is avoiding normal pleasures and as a way of getting closer to God, that's practically non-existent. Most people don't think about that anymore. And of course, it's a civic heresy to deny that all sex is good. That's the climate in which we live. And so I don't imagine that more than 2 or 3 of you will mess this up the way the Corinthians did. But a couple of you might well wonder, is it possible that all sex, even marital intimacy, is a bad use of my body? Wouldn't sex be something, well, think about it, that's pretty much all for me, my pleasure. Where does God and His glory come into it? Isn't sex one of the most selfish things you can do? Maybe all sex is inherently bad. And if you think like that, then you are merging onto the same mental highway that the Corinthian Christians were on. They seem to be thinking that, well, sex has obviously made a cesspool out of their own town. The word Corinthian, as we have learned, is synonymous with debauchery. And maybe God reluctantly permits sex only for procreation, but it's hardly something we're supposed to enjoy, are we? Because people that start enjoying it start over-enjoying it, and pretty soon it's just a mess. And then glorify God with it? How could that ever work? And so you can understand how the Corinthian church writes this. It is good for a man not to engage in sexual relations with a woman, implying not even his wife. Did they get that right? Is that how they're supposed to think? Paul, tell us. And so we have verse 1. Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, Paul apparently quotes from their letter now. It is good, quotation marks, it is good, morally preferred, spiritually advantageous for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Now, if you're carrying the NIV, it badly translates this as it is good not to marry a woman. Literally it says not to touch a woman, which is a common euphemism for sexual intercourse. And of course, that doesn't mean something silly like you can't shake a woman's hand. After all, this is the church that's told to have the holy kiss, chapter 16. But look, these people are in a sex bonkers city that will lead them straight to hell if they don't fight for purity. The place is swamped with prostitution. And so people flee sexual sins, sexual immorality. And so, I don't know, maybe it's not so loony for them to conclude that maybe all sex is a surrender to the enemy's side of things. And hey, these Christians know that Paul is single. He's a single man at this point, probably a widower, celibate by preference. They could well wonder if that's not a requirement for everyone who is serious about a holy life. And doesn't Paul teach that our spirit is superior to our body, our flesh? Shouldn't we reduce our involvement in all things physical so that we can maximize our spirits that will live forever? We should not be groveling when we could be soaring. Well, Paul's answer is as clear as anything can be. Is sex a good thing? Now, I don't mean just in theory, but for a given person, a serious Christian person like you. Well, that all depends on one thing. It depends on whether you're married or not. If you're not married, then sex is not a good thing for you. It's a sin to have sex. But if you're married, it's a sin not to. That's the passage in a nutshell. Now to the details. And by the way, don't expect a lot of illustrations in this message because stories on this topic tend to conjure up images inappropriate for a church service. We might turn 50 shades of red. Plus, illustrations are not needed to keep your interest. I have never known an audience to sleep during any talk on sexual relations. If you fall asleep, they should revoke my ordination. And I should also apologize for appearing to preach to the choir. A check in our church nursery reveals that most of you already know your way around a bedroom. So, Paul begins his answer with something that runs counter to every thread of Greek and Roman culture. In fact, this is breathtakingly countercultural, and in particular the way he puts men and women on the same level when it comes to marital sex. He forms his answer around 3 couplets, at least initially in the first 3 verses here of his answer, back and forth between husband and wife 3 times. Now, Paul is pushing hard on purity, but he disagrees completely with his pious letter writers. Is all sex bad? No, he says, not in marriage. You get married, Paul says, to pursue purity, not to destroy it. Marriage sex is how you flee from immorality, not how you give way to it. And so Paul gives no quarter to the sexless marriage that they were wondering about. Paul makes a negative point first in verse 2 in the first of the 3 couplets. So let's start with that point. The negative point is this: marriage sex, not just marriage, but marriage sex, monogamous, man with woman, faithful, mutual, is good because it reduces the immoral pressures of the hookup culture. Now, I don't say removes them, don't write in the word removes, reduces them to a level where faithful, godly purity is more feasible. So here's verse 2. But because of temptation to sexual immorality, literally it's because of immoralities. That's what you would have in the New American Standard Bible. Porneas is the word. It starts with the idea of prostitution, but then on into all sexual sin. Paul is referring to his readers' proneness to give way to temptations outside of marriage. Some of them may in fact have been going to prostitutes and neglecting their wives. But it probably includes a strong nod just to the rampant immoralities in their culture. Look at where you live. Look around you. Now, we all know about this, right here in River City, as they say. You combine blazing hormones with easy internet access, and you have a combustible brew that approaches the unrestrained debauchery of Corinth. In Corinth, there were enticements on every street corner. That was their internet, as well as temple prostitutes of every stripe and gender to spice up their prayers. And in light of all of that, and to counteract all of that, Paul says that you people must have a committed relationship with a marriage partner under the blessing of God. Now look, purity is certainly not the only reason to get married. Far from it. But this is vital for anybody who intends to glorify God with his body in an evil and perverted generation, which happens to be the kind of generation that we live in. Now, even the Puritans, like 17th century Thomas Watson, saw marriage like that. Listen how he writes about this 300 years ago. It is not having a wife, but loving a wife that makes a man live chastely. He who loves his wife, whom Solomon calls his fountain, will not go abroad to drink muddy, poisoned waters. Pure conjugal love is a gift of God and comes from heaven. But like a vestal fire, it must be cherished that it not go out. He who loves not his wife, and he's talking sexually here, he who loves not his wife is the likeliest person to embrace the bosom of a stranger. And don't miss what's obvious here. Now, Paul is speaking of obligations of both men and women. These are commands. So this is what he says. Each man should have his own wife, and each woman should have, is actually in the original, the exact command to each of them, her own husband. Now, we start with a definition. Have. Doesn't mean simply that every Christian is commanded to get married and then stay pure. Marriage defined as one man, one woman, no polygamy, no marriage, no sex before marriage, no post-marital adultery, no same-sex marriage, obviously. Marriage as a pursuit of purity, faithful to each other. Now, all that is true, but here Paul is not just talking about getting married. He's talking about the sexual activity of those who are married. Understand the culture. The citizens in Corinth got married all the time, but not with any exclusive sexual commitment, at least not for the husband. He got a wife for status. He got a wife for money or for bearing legitimate heirs. It usually wasn't a love thing. In fact, she was often just a middle schooler, barely into puberty. So his sexual needs were easily met at the temples or with outside partners of either sex or with household slaves. Lack of intimacy in the marriage just meant the husband would look elsewhere, was expected to. Now, Paul counters this not by agreeing with them that all sex is bad, just flee it and never do it, but by telling married couples where sex is good. In fact, obligatory in the marriage bed. Purity is not about just what you don't do, but what you do. So now, back to the definition, the word have. The word have does not just mean you must find and take a wife or find and take a husband, got the ring and the certificate and the photo album to prove it. The phrase have a wife in biblical Greek doesn't mean then simply take a wife, but involves and connotes an active, ongoing sexual relationship between husband and wife. one that we learn here is the responsibility of both spouses to maintain. Plus, this command is in the present tense, and so it means something like be regularly having sexual intimacy with your spouse. Once is not enough. Once in a while is not enough. A Christian spouse, I don't know if you agree with this, listen to this. A Christian spouse, male or female, is commanded to have intimate contact with his or her spouse often enough so that neither gives the other any excuse for cheating. That's what this whole sentence means. And yeah, that's in the Bible. Your assignment from this message is embarrassingly obvious. Now, if your sex life at home is lagging, you aren't the first to experience it. But that needs to change unless we have special circumstances, which we'll mention later. Now, not to jump ahead, but the problem at Corinth surfaces directly in verse 5, where Paul commands them to stop depriving each other. Maybe they thought they had good and godly reasons, but Paul says, no, you got to stop that. Now, how is that change going to happen? If the couple is lacking in this area, Paul gives them a solution. Again, a very mutual solution, shockingly so. Look at verses 3 and 4, and here's Paul's point, and this time positive. So let's just get on with this. In these two verses, and in the very first part of verse 5, we learn this. Marriage sex works when both partners recognize and promote the conjugal rights of the other, each of whom owns the body of their partner. To withhold sex is not an act of purity, but of sin, a defrauding of what is owed. Now let's start with verse 3. So you want to turn your notes to the second page already. Paul starts with a command to husbands and then the same to wives. Again, it's present tense. The husband should give, meaning give and keep on giving and do so consistently to his wife, her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife should give and keep regularly giving conjugal rights to her husband. Now, Paul hopes to enlarge their perspective. The typical man of that time and culture thought of a woman as having sexual duty and a man as having a sexual privilege. You might have thought of marriage that way at some time, although I hope you'd be embarrassed to admit it. But she would be there if you needed her. Or in that day, a husband could divorce his wife if she did not cooperate. But if he was using slaves and prostitutes and then neglecting her completely, he owed her nothing. You see, it was not reciprocal at all. There is not actually some technical word here for conjugal rights. The phrase Paul uses simply means to render or pay back what is owed. Wow. I mean, it's obviously talking about sexual intimacy, but that's not very romantic. It's commercial terms for a debt that is now due. But these words do important work. And let's get some ideas down here as we go along. First of all, this is big, each married partner must enter the bedroom with the perspective that here is a place for giving, not getting or taking or demanding. Not you owe me, but I owe you. Got it? Write that down. Sex is about giving, not taking. Secondly, each must see that the other is someone to whom you are indebted. So it is a giving, but it's not just like a grace gift from the kindness of your heart. You can give it or not, depending on whether you feel generous enough or amorous enough or having mercy on them or something. No, it is something that's owed. It's not a donation, it's a debt. And so let's say you are married. You owe your spouse the pleasures of intimacy as their right. Not just when you're in the mood. Their right becomes your responsibility. And no one can pay this debt to them, only you, because you're the only one that owes it. And that's why Paul uses the word defraud down in verse 5. Now, I know the ESV has the word deprive. Do not deprive. Literally, it means stop defrauding. Stop cheating them. And it's the same word we had in chapter 6, verse 7. Remember where it said, instead of suing somebody, that it might be better just to be defrauded, cheated, choose to suffer the loss of what was owed you. So withholding sex from your partner is actually a theft. And when you fail to address the sexual desires of your spouse, you not only tempt them to cheat on you, you are in fact already cheating them. Now, who says you owe them and they owe you? God does. It's right here in black and white. And then again, this is present tense. And so this is not a debt that you can pay all in one night on your honeymoon. This is a continuous obligation throughout one's marriage. And I suppose, well, maybe until you're too old to remember or care. And then this obligation is man and woman, both ways, mutual. The right to sexual pleasure and fulfillment belongs to both spouses equally, and then the obligation to satisfy belongs to both spouses equally. It's the duty of each, it's the right of each, it's the privilege of each. And so set aside completely the twisted construct that a wife is there to fulfill her duty while her husband uses her to satisfy himself. I doubt that any of you actually thought that when you came in here, but that is totally worth saying. And if you guys ever walk into your bedroom with such a thinly veiled selfishness, where she's the giver, she's the payer, you're the taker, the bill collector, you will never have a sexual life that pleases God. You might feel satisfied, but God won't, and she definitely won't. Sexual pleasure is the duty and the privilege of both. That's the only way it works, as God intended. So let's just repeat it. Let's say it like this. Married sex works when both partners recognize and promote the conjugal rights of the other, each of whom owns the body of their partner. That's what we'll get in verse 4. To withhold sex is not an act of purity, but of sin, a defrauding of what is owed. The start of chapter 5, or verse 5. Now what Paul adds in verse 4 is sort of the flip side of the idea of paying a debt that has come due. The person who owes you owns you. So this verse is about who owns your body, who has authority, who has the final word about what happens with your body. Now Paul now begins with the wife for the first time. The other ones he started with the husband, but here he starts with the wife, and I think he does so that he can end with the most radical statement yet, that the man doesn't own his body, but the wife owns her husband's body. And of course, no one in Corinth had ever heard or even dreamt of the idea that somehow a husband's body belonged to his wife. That's outrageous. It's ridiculous. But Paul just states it clearly. He said, the wife does not have authority over her own body. But a strong contrast here, very much the opposite, the husband does. And while the readers would freely agree up to that point, I mean that, especially the husbands, hooray for Paul, he's our hero. Give that man a raise, dilly dilly. But Paul he is not finished. Likewise, they said, now what's he going to say? Because now they get a little suspicious because he's doing these contrasts. And he says, wait a minute. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but same strong contrast, just the reverse, the wife does. Shocked silence. Can you hear the pin drop? Now, this is not only the most radical thing that Paul says about married couples, it's almost impossible to explain. Many husbands think that they know what this verse is saying. And they trot it out whenever their wife is having a headache a little too often, and they clobber her over the head with it, which is not too helpful. This verse is certainly the text least likely to be cross-stitched. But only because it is misunderstood and misused by Neanderthals, and their wives too. They read only half the verse. If you read the whole verse, it ought to go up in every bedroom. Look, this is talking about reciprocal ownership. But what does that mean? I think it must relate somehow to oneness. But I can't think of anything else quite like this in the whole wide world that we live in. How can you be owned by the thing that you own, or vice versa? And when you think about it, you say, well, why can't this mean that when a husband wants it, a wife can order his body to leave her alone? Right? Bud, keep my body over on the other side of the bed. Well, where does that get anyone except a stalemate? That cannot be what he's talking about. Well, first start with this. Let's start with the purity piece. Husband, your body belongs to your wife, not to some slave, not to some prostitute, not even to yourself, to pleasure yourself. It is for her pleasure exclusively. And the same for wives. Honey, this body belongs to you and to no one else, ever. Now, if you hate this idea, don't get married. This is what vows to be faithful are all about. The vows. And keep only unto her as long as you both shall live. Marriage means releasing authority over your body to your spouse. And the marriage vows used to have this explicitly in the ring part of the ceremony. With this ring I thee wed. Have you ever heard that? Not in recent weddings. But anyway, with this ring I thee wed. And of course, there's a great joke on that of the preacher that says, and with this wing I thee wed. Anyway, and then the second part of it. With my body I thee worship. Wow. With my body I thee worship. That ring on your finger means someone owns you. It is a magnificent belonging. And it also means all rivals go jump in a lake. Now, second, this verse means that when your spouse is wanting to get intimate, you say yes. I'm here for you unless circumstances are unusual, because this body belongs to you. And if the circumstances are unusual, then there's some humble appeal. Sorry, hon, I'm having my period, or I have to be to work super early tomorrow and I'm already exhausted. Can we do it tomorrow night? But not this. You oversexed lummox, keep your hands to yourself. You already did it twice this year. So you don't get to use a slight headache to put off your spouse. However, some of you have horrible headaches. And you may have other ongoing issues, some of them physical, but things that a sensitive, loving spouse should already be aware could make you unlikely to want to appreciate sex right then, or even for a time. And your choice, of course. Well, you just had a baby. Or you have a fear of getting pregnant in that situation, or you have a fear of not getting pregnant. These are issues that a sensitive husband's going to think about. Many things can affect sexual desire and availability. They all call for sensitivity. So when I say this thing, an automatic yes, I'm putting some asterisks on that. Menopause, aging can affect all of this. Fresh, crippling grief or any kind of a heavy crisis, a bout of depression, a lack of privacy. Hey, there are guests in the next room, her parents. Or let's say you got a big argument. Wow. And you're the husband, you want to settle it by making love, but she knows that you use that to avoid actually resolving things like adults. Like you saying, I'm sorry, you were right as usual. Now, I'm just kidding on that. Well, every good spouse should be aware of things that make it hard for their lover to be open to sexual advances and not just say, hey, babe, and then expect immediate reciprocation. Now, when you realize your spouse is regularly resistant to your advances and not very excited to make love when he or she does, it is often the signal to work on other things in your marriage. I think this always has to be said. Now, it doesn't mean you don't go ahead and make love. But let's say you're the guy and she's a little reluctant. Maybe it's just as simple as that you're not very good at lovemaking. You need to fix that. You need help with technique maybe, or just understanding. You're thinking, well, men and women are the same. No, they're not. You think, well, if she were just like me, this would be easy. Well, that is possible, but she's not. And if you want help on this, quit watching porn thinking, oh, this is how you learn. No, you do not learn anything there except how to be selfish and to get the delusion that somehow sex is easy. Sex is not. And so you should get a godly book like Intended for Pleasure by Dr. Ed Wheat, and there are others that we could recommend to you. But maybe you never heard that foreplay starts with kindness at the breakfast table. One wise counselor wrote long ago, people admit that it's hard to pray, yet they think it's easy to make love. What nonsense. Neither is worth much when it is only the outcropping of intermittent enthusiasm. Both need to be done without ceasing, and that puts a premium on the minor manifestations. Obviously, the sexual act is central. But the circle that is drawn around it consists of 1,000 small passes and light touches by a vast amount of incidental tenderness. Now, that's something worth cross-stitching. A vast amount of incidental tenderness. A lack of sexual desire in a wife can be, here, this is another thing, can be the leftover of a rejection earlier in the marriage, or his affair, or catching him in porn, or something like that. The lingering hurt and the thought of being rejected again may seem too great to overcome. And so husbands, move toward her anyway, but not in a demanding spirit, with a broken spirit over what you did. Now, she might forgive you. She might even make love to you. But she may not fully trust you for a good long time, and that will dampen her responsiveness to you until she trusts you again. You see, there's some big threats to marital response. Fear. There are 4 of these: fear, guilt, anger, and then to be viewed with disgust or rejection. Now here's something else. Unsatisfying sex can be just a symptom of your overall lack of intimacy. You don't communicate outside the bedroom either. You can work on that. Maybe one of you has unusual levels of insecurity. Be reassuring and patient. Maybe she has insecurity about how she looks. You know, she's gained 10 pounds and she's that much less excited to make love to you. And so remind her that you value her as the only person on this planet who can give you the joy of physical love, a physical relationship, without guilt. She's unique. There's no one like her. She doesn't have to be a cover girl. The most alluring woman on earth can never be a better lover than she is. And then maybe one of you carries wounds of abuse from your past. Go slow, be a healer. Do nothing that reminds him or her of the bully who hurt them. And then admire your spouse for even being willing to be married. What courage. And above all, never try to shame or insult your spouse into sex. Don't compare them to past boyfriends and girlfriends when you're mad. And don't shake a Bible at them. Many people have a suppressed sexual response because they already feel guilty. And all that being said, and then dealt with initially, patiently, whatever, you still start. Let's just start. This is ground zero. You still start with the mutual agreement that neither partner should have to twist the other person's arms to get them to bed. Nate wanted me to call this sermon, "When She Wants It, Give It to Her." Well, Nate is a sanctified man. I think most men would prefer the other title, "When He Wants It." But anyway. But now look, as a Christian couple, you ought to settle this issue for all time when you first get married. If the other person is hot to trot, the answer is already a given. It's already yes. It's already decided. Either one can initiate sex and expect an affirmative response from their partner. Unfortunately, I think people today are so busy that they tend to have less sex less often than the 3 to 4 day cycle of peak desire. And that's probably not good. But in the end, how much sex is good in a marriage? Well, here's a benchmark. As often as the other person wants it. That's where we start. Well, that's not the whole story. Let's take a third thing here. You do not use sex as a bargaining chip, a bribe, a manipulation, or a revenge, a payback, a punishment. Hey, buddy, do what I want or you're on the couch. It is already owed. It's a question of authority. Neither of you has the authority to make or say a categorical no. Your body is not your own. You gave up the right to say "I won't" when you said "I do." Well, how about this? And now I have to dig a little below the surface. Maybe this is the best time to bring up the famous and ever frustrating difference between the sexes. That men and women often seem to need, on the average, different frequency in order to feel satisfied and content. Have you ever noticed that? You're supposed to laugh when I say that. Well, I've met guys that want sex so often that they start to accuse their wife of having the gift of celibacy. And she starts accusing him of being a sex maniac. One of my relatives got married about 100 years ago, one of my grandfathers, and actually thought passages like this meant he was supposed to have sex every night. Bruce, please tell me that's true. Well, it drove him to a nervous breakdown, which saved my grandma from having one first. Well, this is the frequency dilemma. And I think this verse provides an answer, at least a partial one. And I don't think the solution is quite so simple that whoever wants it most often automatically wins. The solution is much better than that. It's much richer and it's much sweeter. The idea of mutual ownership means that a husband, let's say the husband who would love to insist on his frequency, and let's say the wife might be willing to go along with that. must also consider the fact that her doing her duty is hardly the greatest thing that a man could want. Is it really that wonderful to make love to someone who has to, who is doing it out of biblical duty, even though she doesn't want to? Wouldn't if it were really up to her? Is that all a man wants? Does he not also want to be wanted? Now remember, yes, her body belongs to him. His body belongs to her. The question is he using his body, which is her body, in a way that honors her authority? Do you get what I'm asking you to take into account? It's not just what you want. His main focus ought to be not on I own you, but you own me. Therefore, I will not deprive you, and I will not use you in some way that violates your dignity as my owner, or the dignity of your master who bought you, who owns your body as well. And then how dare I selfishly mistreat her body, the body Jesus suffered to redeem, but rather nourish and cherish it, as Paul tells us as husbands in Ephesians 5. You know, the closest thing I can think of to this kind of authority is the way elders are asked to lead a congregation. The congregation is commanded to submit to them, Hebrews 13. But they are given authority not for their own benefit, but for the good of the people. And we call that servant leadership. And when that's going well, the chiefs of the church are really its happy and humble slaves. Now let's call what we have in verse 4 servant sex. And so a wife who owns her husband's body is responsible to serve his body for its good, his good, not hers. And the husband who owns his wife's body is supposed to serve her body for its good, not his. That's servant sex. And so husband, think of yourself like let's just say like a slave, lowly, but summoned amazingly to the sovereign, to the castle of the king, and to the chamber of the king's beloved princess. And think of your bedroom as that chamber where you serve the delights of the king's daughter. What a privilege. How humbled and grateful you feel that you get to pursue her interests. Her wish is your command. You don't demand, you serve, you listen. Does she want to be held? You hold her. Does she want to talk? You listen and reply. In the end, nothing makes you happier than to know that she enjoyed being with you. That is the spirit of servant sex. Now, this verse also provides an answer to the question about what to do when one partner wants to experiment in the bedroom. And I don't know of any sermon that I've ever heard that ever treats this, so if you don't like this part, then just delete it. But there's sometimes somebody wants to do something that the other finds bizarre or distasteful. And when you read this verse, somebody says, if I really told him, your wish is my command, he would come up with stuff that I think is ridiculous. Now, what must we submit dutifully to every sort of sex our spouse thinks would be fun? We'll start out by saying this, that the marriage bed is undefiled. That's Hebrews 13 again. The Song of Solomon certainly celebrates a very free-spirited expression of love. Solomon describes intimacy in terms of a delight, a wonderful, erotic, creative, playful, uninhibited exploration of each other. Is there anything that shouldn't happen in a Christian couple's bed? Well, everything technically is lawful. We could start there, permitted, but not everything is helpful or edifying. In fact, you should rule out immediately things that cause damage or things that are blatantly unnatural, some kind of kinky fetish. I don't think we all want to go there at all. Or pressuring you to watch porn in order to spice things up. Now you're into a sin territory. But anyway, let me give you some quick rules of thumb for this. You just think about these. Number one, we live in a culture where there's a lot of porn, so be very cautious and morally suspicious about introducing anything into your bedroom that would never have occurred to you if it weren't for pornography. Porn habits of one spouse or the other are actually inhibitors to the natural thrills of regular sex. So if you're the partner, you don't have to accommodate that. He or she, whoever has been viewing it, needs to seek the recovery of a normal appetite. Could take some time. But you don't help that by going along with it. The second thing is avoid anything that makes your lover suspect that you love sex more than you love him or her. That make sense? Here's another one. Rule of thumb. Avoid anything that actually reduces your partner's desire rather than increasing it. Like making her act like a slut. I mean, you never help your marriage by trying to turn the sweet girl you're married into Stormy Daniels. And then, and this is probably the biggest thing, avoid everything that you are not both honestly agreed on. And make sure that the other person is not just embarrassed to say no. I'm saying honestly. This is the most important guideline. Are you honestly agreed? Not that you're both equally excited about trying something, but are you agreed? We could do this. This is good. Let me end this section with this. A question. And I'm going to address this to husbands especially. I want you to ask the question, what do I really deserve? You're lying in bed angry, your bride isn't giving you what you wanted or think that you needed. Maybe that's when you ought to ask yourself, what do I really deserve? When I think about the many lustful thoughts I may have had since we got married and could rightly have been sent to hell, then I say this, one night with her was already more than I deserve. You know, when you ask that question, that is the fountain of gratitude and the beautiful emancipation of your spouse from the prison of your expectations. And then if you ask your soul, hey, how's your sex life? And then you say, infinitely better than I deserve. Now, verse 5 starts with a negative command put in a form that implies that he's trying to stop something that's already going on. He will answer the question, is abstinence ever okay for married people? I'm going to treat this rather quickly, but when he says do not deprive one another, it means stop defrauding one another. But he gives you an exception to that. There's something that's permitted that would not be defrauding, and that is that, except perhaps, meaning this is hypothetical, not mandatory, that you could agree together, by agreement, that both of you are agreeing on this, for a limited time, set ahead of time as part of this agreement, implying a short time, as we will see. I would say in days at most, not months. Maybe think how long you would fast from food. That you, one or both of you, but it sounds like both, may devote yourselves to prayer. Now, the purpose must be something of high value. Prayer would be of high value. Taking a couple of months off to work on your stamp collection would not be. But here is something that is valuable, that requires time and concentration, that normal sexual relations could distract from or not permit. It's not because sexual relations are sinful and would inhibit prayer. It's not that at all. It's that you must devote yourself to prayer. So, in fact, it says the prayer. So it could refer to a specific church-led call to prayer that would involve setting aside work and other normal activities. Now, that's the exception that Paul would tolerate. But then Paul explains why the time limit, and this is how this fits so well with this whole context. And then come together again, resume your normal intimacy as planned, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. This is so realistic, it's amazing. Here again, we have to remind ourselves that temptations can become unbearable when a marriage becomes romantically or erotically broken. And I don't think I need to prove that to you. When you withhold from your partner, you risk putting them in a place where Satan can defeat them. And someone said that the same devil who will work overtime to get two people into bed together before they are married will work twice as hard to keep them away from each other once they are married. So do you love your wife? Do you love your husband? Then why would you ever put them in a situation where Satan can maul them? Shouldn't you be the first line of defense? Shouldn't you be one another's fiercest champions for purity? Well, Paul ends this with a significant concession, and this is chapter 7, verse 6. I don't believe the this of verse 6 points backwards, although it could. A prayer break is optional, not mandatory. I concede that, but it's not for everybody. But I think it points forward to what he's about to say in verse 7. The idea that maybe everyone should remain single like Paul, or should they all get married? I put the question like this: should everyone get married to avoid sexual compromise? And the answer he gives is this: yes, unless someone has the gift for celibacy like he does. A sexually active singleness is wrong. A sexless marriage is wrong. Married intimacy is also a gift. Let's read the verse, or the verse says, "Now, as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am," meaning unmarried and celibate. Now, Paul will give his reasons later. We'll get much more on this. The value of singleness, the value of celibacy as we push forward in this chapter. But this is a wonderful balance between the value of singleness and the value of marriage. This is never more obvious than when you get to the last little sentence. But each has his own gift, his charisma from God, one of one kind and one of another. One of one kind, singleness. One of another, for marriage. A gift for celibacy, a gift for married intimacy. The gift of sex. It's a gift. Now, if marital sex is a gift, then it must be something very good. As good and glorious as the God who gave it. And I hope that doesn't feel like a mockery for those of you who have experienced sex as a curse or a disappointment, a frustration, even a disaster. In spite of all you're trying to know it is good or to make it good or making love something truly loving, it just seems to fall to something else, a conflict. Not good at all. Maybe you've given up on it ever being something good. In fact, maybe you started into sex immorally and never found your way back to pure intimacy. Never found a way to combine the gift of sex with the gift of utter forgiveness. The ultimate white, washed clean by the blood of Christ. Or you were damaged by someone who misused God's gift as if they owed him nothing and just shattered a life with something only intended to bless the human race. And yet none of those things remove the fact God intended and intends sex to be his gift of joy. The joy of children often. The joy of ecstasy. The joy of unmasked union for souls who long to be not alone, like the union of a triune God writ small. The joy of something so earthly and yet so heavenly that it makes heaven seem inevitable. I know it is a gift to the African people that I know who have so few pleasures, whose hunger, whose joblessness, vulnerabilities, what about the future? Whose frequent griefs make this their one solace apart from God's holy presence. To retire to a humble home, thatched walls, thatched roof, dirt floor, a little fire, and in the night find release in each other's arms. In a common blessedness not one whit less than that of the richest prince and princess of England on their honeymoon. If it is God's gift to us, we must certainly not despise it as beneath us. Any gift then is a stewardship that is not to be wasted or taken for granted. To neglect it is to dishonor him. If it is God's gift to us, then it means it is a ministry, like any charisma, which a charisma, that's a gift to be used not for yourself, to gratify yourself, to be invested in the service of another. The Israelite newlywed must not be sent to war. You can't deploy a young, newly married man because it says he must be free for a whole year to do nothing but make his wife happy. Takes a year to learn how. And later in the chapter, Paul will reveal the calling of married people. Those gifted for marriage, the husband is to focus on how he may please his wife, and the wife on how she may please her husband. And there's not one word about getting married so that you can please yourself. And then if marital sex is a gift, then it is God sharing with us a joy that brings him joy. This is not a sermon about sex. This is a sermon about God, the joy of God. Sex teaches us this about God, that his delight is to bring us delight, and our delight is to bring joy back to him by being delighted in the gifts he gives. Now that's the godly, wonderful thing that sex teaches us every time. Do you not know this? And you as a lover could hardly be happier than when he or she is happy. And be careful to understand what I'm saying. If you're the husband, she's the wife, it's not that she must always have an orgasm or you have failed. She may not need or want that, but she certainly doesn't need the pressure of that. That's not what I'm talking about. To make her happy. And if my spouse is not happy, no happiness of my own can take away the sadness that I have over her lack. The blessedness of life is seeking joy for ourselves in the joy of our beloved, just as God with us, his bride. The miserable marriage is not so because the husband and the wife seek or value their own pleasure, but because they do it, they do not seek it in the pleasure of their spouse. Paraphrasing John Piper. Now, why is God so interested in what happens in your bedroom? Get back to where we started. Because God is all about joy, and he is very happy when his bride is happy. And he grieves whenever she is not. And that's why Paul wants to improve our sex lives for the glory and the enjoyment of God. And so that you can see how his heart works. So you can bless him with pleasure every time you surrender yourself to the joy of making your wife or your husband happy. This is worship. Using the bodies that God bought with the blood of the cross to glorify him. If your bodies are temples, then this is where you both meet God in each other. And if this text means something new to you, you might whisper to your spouse, hey, let's go home and glorify God. A final thing, if marital sex is a gift, why don't we thank him for it? Like we do before a meal of food that he provides. Go home and read 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 3 and following. For there it talks about how you can't forbid from marriage or from foods because God gave them to be received with thanksgiving. And read the whole thing. But how many of you would not think of eating without thanking God? And then how many of you would think of making love to your wife and receiving the gift of sex and the joy of making her happy or your husband happy and not start with thanksgiving? God, this is wonderful. Help this be all that you want it to be. You are so kind to us. Thank you. Let us honor you with this. And then I want you to take this as a walk away, to schedule a bedroom talk that may be seriously overdue. I've given you several questions to get you started. They're in your notes. But I want you to know this, that God will help you. Start with prayer. And if that talk only makes things worse, next week we'll be talking about divorce. Well, no, please. Do not give up on your marriage even if you never get the sexual fireworks that you expected. I end with a story about Jonathan Edwards. On March 22nd, 1758, Jonathan Edwards lay dying, and he gave a final message to his wife, Sarah. To my dear wife, tell her that the uncommon union that has so long subsisted between us has been of such a nature as I trust is spiritual and will therefore continue forever. Now, it's been observed that Sarah was 7 years younger than Jonathan, totally unlike him. He was moody, she was vibrant, he was shy, she was outgoing, he was socially inept, awkward. She was a natural conversationalist. He was gawky, she was graceful. You would not call what they had a completely compatible union. And still this uncommon union produced its share of harmony and love and esteem. A study of 1,400 descendants of Jonathan and Sarah Edwards indicated that it had produced 13 college presidents, 65 professors, 100 lawyers, 30 judges, 66 physicians, and 8 holders of office, including 3 senators, 3 governors, and a vice president of the United States. In the end, it's never all about you. It's never all about your bedroom. It's that God has a plan. And he gifts you for what he gifts you for, even if you never get a vice president out of it. It's that you just honor God. It's all about the glory of God. Let's pray. Father in glory, we are humbled to talk about something so mundane, so mysteriously wonderful at the same time. I pray that I have not trivialized something that is both this sacred and this common. We love you for the gifts you have given, including the gift of singing, of playing, of dancing before you if we care, of making our lives available to you, even in this moment. Thank you in Christ's name. Amen.